Our first presenter is Samuel Davidson, a PhD candidate at Princeton Theological Seminary, where his research explores the intersection of psychology, ecology, and systematic theology. The title of his presentation is Phobia as Ecological Hermeneutic, Agoraphobic Phenomenology, and Willie James Jennings's Vision of Creation. Welcome, Samuel.
Thanks. So I will note before we get started that this is a highly abbreviated version of a 3,500 word paper that probably needed to be an 8,000 word paper, and which is sort of on its way to being developed into a dissertation theme. So I'm going to be moving very quickly. I apologize. I made a slideshow to make up for it. Hopefully it's not too fast. So Willie James Jennings has recently argued that the task of a Christian doctrine of creation in the wake of whiteness and colonialism must be to find ways of re-establishing a sense of creaturely connection with a natural world of bodies, plants, animals, land, place, and space. In the Christian imagination, he contends that racialized existence is made possible as a result of colonial European theology's separation of peoples from place. Conceiving ideal, read white, masculine, European, Christian, human nature, as essentially disjunctive from the natural world, the colonial imagination severed any meaningful or identity facilitating connection between people and their environs, with the result that this lacuna of identity markers was filled in with an essentializing notion of race. Land, place, and space were correspondingly voided of meaning, stripped of sacred possibility, and reduced to the terms of potential extraction value. To repair this catastrophic conceptual breach and its practical consequences, he suggests the necessity for Christian theology to develop a doctrine of creation that foregrounds the essential interconnectivity of all peoples and persons with land, place, and space. Rather than an abstract theory about divine power or an account of human evolutionary origins, he insists that a doctrine of creation must be, quote, first a doctrine of place and people, of divine love and divine touch, of human presence and embrace, and of divine and human interaction, a way of seeing place in its fullest sense. In a more recent International Journal of Systematic Theology article, he has further indicated how a properly Christian doctrine of creation must nurture an awareness of our fundamental creaturely connection that was all but destroyed through the enclosing effects of the colonial imagination. Seeking to take up Jennings' critical challenge to such objectifying hermeneutics of the natural world, this essay suggests that we might derive creative theological tools for developing an ecological hermeneutic from a somewhat unintuitive resource, namely the phenomenology of psychological disorder. Specifically, I argue that doctrines of anthropology and creation may be refined by close attention to the phenomenology of agoraphobia. Drawing on my own phobic experience in the existing phenomenological literature, I contend that close attention to the agoraphobic mode of being in the world underscores the embodied, intersubjective, and placed character of human nature in an acute and distinctive manner. As such, it can serve an illuminating function, drawing into sharp relief the fragmented and ultimately destructive illusions of the colonial imagination that abstracts human beings from the world of which they are a part. So, agoraphobia, a phenomenological sketch. First named in the late 19th century, agoraphobia was originally conceived as a fear of open spaces. However, since the surge of research in the 1970s, psychology has come to understand it as a more complex anxiety pertaining to open, enclosed, public, or social spaces, and triggered in situations from which there is no easily available retreat to the home. The typical course of development is as follows. After the occurrence of a panic attack in one or more of these settings, anxiety generalizes to an ever-broadening range of situations through avoidant conditioning of such scenarios, such that the agoraphobe becomes progressively more attached to the immediate vicinity of the home as an increasingly restricted zone of safety. The result is compulsively phobic avoidance of places and scenarios from which retreat to the home is impeded. For up to 1/3 of sufferers, this results in becoming completely homebound. While the mechanics of agoraphobia have been thoroughly described by psychological research, the objective character of such investigations takes us only so far in understanding the complexity of lived agoraphobic experience. By attending to the subjective structure of that experience, recent phenomenological approaches have drawn attention to dimensions of this mode of being in the world that exceed the descriptions of psychology proper, bringing to the fore a number of significant existential themes. The body, other persons, space, and place emerge most prominently in terms of their relation to the pathological and often surreal experience of agoraphobic anxiety. This surrealness may include a lost sense of bodily ownership resembling schizophrenic symptomology, distortions of spatial perception, and an inability to retain a bounded sense of self outside of the home and/or in the presence of others. In short, we may characterize the anxious agoraphobe's experience of the world and of the self within it as an unpredictable combination of melting, spinning, disintegrating, bending, penetrating, nauseating, crushing, and suffocating. We'll turn now to our four themes and their interrelation. The most immediate symptomatic issue in agoraphobic anxiety is the agoraphobe's tenuous grip on his sense of bodily control or ownership. The agoraphobe experiences the overwhelming physical sensations of anxiety and/or panic as descending upon him from an unidentifiable exterior source, and so as alien to and undermining of his sense of agential selfhood. As a result of such repeated experience, he comes to live in a perpetual state of bodily vigilance, constantly adjudicating between safe and unsafe bodily sensations. The latter are taken to signal impending death or a collapse of selfhood associated with panic. His anxiety is thereby bound to physical sensations and a troubled relation to the body that perceives them. Closely related to this ambiguity is the way the agoraphobe's relation to other selves becomes problematized when anxious. Prior to any intellectual intentionality or verbal communication with other minds, the body is receptive and attuned to the shared materiality of other bodies, through which affect and mood are mediated. When anxious, the agoraphobe becomes and remains, to his own horror, acutely aware of the fact that he can under no circumstances withdraw from this essential material connectedness with others, whose organic materiality imposes on his own regardless of his wishes. The inescapable nature of this connection renders his desired degree of control over the body unattainable, reducing him to a felt state of fragmentation and impending collapse. Space comes to the fore in the agoraphobe's inability to, quote, assert their own spatiality in the face of the spaces of others, unquote. This integral insight of agoraphobic phenomenology by Joyce Davidson pertains to the sociality of space. As Davidson highlights, the agoraphobe's highly sensitized mode of being means that he is acutely tuned into the ways in which social space is charged and populated with the constructions of others at a pre-conscious level. Such hyper-awareness and hypersensitivity to the expectations, corporeal moods, and implicit demands of others undermines his ability to retain his sense of self as bounded and grounded. The prominence of spatiality bleeds into that of place in the agoraphobe's dependence on the home or its immediate surroundings, for it is primarily when he leaves the existential safety of home that he is seized by anxiety. This reflects the fact that the agoraphobe is unable to carry a sense of being at home in the world. He's unable to carry a sense of being at home with him into the world. The physical structure of the home thus comes to function as his ontological center, apart from which he's unable to feel placed in the world. His relation to space and place is at all times mediated by his orientation to the physical locale of the home, and he's able to navigate the world only insofar as he feels that he has unimpeded access to it. We thus have a working sketch of agoraphobic phenomenology, and 2 points should be made. First, the dimensions of agoraphobic experience explored here are not of merely esoteric relevance for those with an interest in psychological curiosities. Rather, by attending to the disruptions of bodily, intercorporeal, and spatial relations that play in agoraphobia, these essential aspects of all human existence, which are more easily overlooked or ignored in non-pathological life, are drawn into sharp relief. And second, the confluence of themes that have emerged here press us toward an ecological vision of the human person, by elucidating the essential intertwinement of identity and selfhood with the given realities of space, place, and embodied sociality. The phenomenology of agoraphobia thus resists any notion of the human being as cognitively autonomous or spiritually detached from the realities of their physical environment. In so doing, it sharpens and clarifies the semiotic capacities inherent in a world of space, place, and bodies that Jennings foregrounds as essential to a creation theology. Contrary to the objectifying and desacralizing vision of creation characteristic of the colonial imagination, we are not external observers examining the world from an indifferent perspective and independently acting upon it. Rather, we are bound to the earth, wrapped up with the fleshy world of bodies, animals, plants, land, and places, in inextricably mutual relations of materiality and semiosis. Such are the overlapping claims of agoraphobic phenomenology and Jennings' critical doctrine of creation. Both allow us to see that a subconscious, pre-intellective, material interconnectivity with the world precedes our cognitive engagements or schematic interpretations of the natural and built environments of which we are a part, thus providing a promising starting point for relearning to see ourselves as thoroughly ecological creatures. In conclusion, then, I want to posit a few trajectories along which the kind of ecological or hermeneutic I have suggested here may productively lead us. First, the insights of agoraphobic phenomenology can sharpen and solidify Jennings' doctrinal concerns by illuminating the ways in which the colonial imagination fails to do justice to the placed and embodied reality of human existence. Second, taking agoraphobic phenomenology seriously presses us towards something like a Jenningsian doctrine of creation for the sake of explanatory power to render such experience coherent, and therefore toward a critique of the anthropological assumptions that have underpinned hegemonic Western notions of person, self, and mind. Third, and further to this effect, Jennings' vision of creation allows us to see agoraphobic experience as something more than a peculiar pathological misperception of the world. If we begin with his notion of creaturely connection, it is not at all surprising that the character and location of particular places or the bodily spatiality of others can profoundly impact my own embodied subjectivity. The so-called pathology of agoraphobia can therefore be seen not in the fact that such features of the world affect the agoraphobe, but in the degree to which he is unable to respond constructively to and with them. A broader view of neurosis with potential for far more meaningful interpretation and therapeutic response. Finally, then, in conversation with Jennings' vision of creation, such a non-reductive account of agoraphobia and the agoraphobic self therefore spurs us on toward an ecological account of the human being, both psychologically and theologically, opening up an ecological hermeneutic that attends to our fundamental creaturely relatedness in and with the world. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. That was so fascinating. So does anyone have any questions? You can feel free to use the raise your hand function or raise your physical hand or add something into the chat. So I have an initial question as people start thinking about things. I thought that that was just a really fascinating way to look at kind of our own general fears about kind of like entering into the outside world and also nature and kind of connecting it to like wilderness and fears of wilderness. But also thinking about, I personally am Jewish, and I, in the Torah and Genesis, God talks about how humans have dominion over in the natural world and kind of creates that space between humans and other beings of creation, and wondering how we can bring that together with this kind of new doctrine of thinking of ourselves as part of creation and caring for them as well, and not having this kind of fear and separation between us.
Yeah, so there's any number of ways to answer that question. Obviously, some textual, some more constructively theological, some just generally ethical. My own sense is that the dominion given in Genesis is not domination, but domicile. We're given a place to live. We're given a place to till and to care for, and given a set of relations with God's creation, of which we are one muddy, dirty part called out of the ground and given God's breath. So yeah, that obviously the dominion text has been used in sort of massively hegemonic and oppressive ways and destructive ways. But at the risk of sounding like way overly simplistic and trite, I think it's a misreading. And I think it's one that increasingly people in various Christian and Jewish traditions are starting to realize is a misreading of the text, either in its original sense, which obviously we don't have access to, but at the same time, the fact that to read it as such means destruction, I think, is an indication that it is in fact a misreading. So yeah, I think somebody asked Professor Copeland in the her introductory remarks, like, do we have to get rid of any sort of human or anthropocentric distinction? And I tend to agree with her that we don't necessarily have to say there's nothing special about human beings in order to also see ourselves as fully ecological and fully interconnected. What we would say is special about human beings then is a call to tend the earth, a call to care for creatures, our fellow creatures, in a way that we sort of uniquely have the capacity to do, rather than to do whatever we want with them.
Great, thank you. Niam? Sorry.
Thanks. Thank you for your paper. One of the things that I think is really fascinating about looking at questions of anthropology from kind of psychopathology or psychological disorder is, as you said, this sense that actually in our everyday interactions and our everyday being in the world, we rely on this very implicit sense of trust in the world. And I think that's increasingly something that's being researched in these other kind of disciplines, is how do we rely on trust in our surroundings, in our environments, to be able to do the things that we take for granted, like feeling and thinking and so on. And I'm just wondering what's your sense of how kind of would you go about applying this more therapeutically, to the sense of how do we regain a sense of trust in the world where that's not implicit? What can theology offer us there?
Yeah, very good question. Enormous question that I sort of partially explored in my master's thesis a few years ago and will need to further flesh out in the PhD dissertation. Yeah, I think part of regaining a sense of trust, a sort of existential trust, like an implicit trust, as you say, not one that we're sort of thinking about, like, can I rely on the sun to come up today? But simply like, can I rely on my body in the way that it sort of habitually interacts with the world? Can I rely on my body to not betray me at any given moment? Sort of these questions. I think part of therapeutically learning to do that, and this is speaking quite autobiographically, is simply coming to terms with the fact that you cannot, in fact, have complete control over the body. You cannot, in fact, have complete control over the environments through which the body moves. That to be creaturely is to be contingent. And I think that sort of a pet thesis that I have been working on is part of the reason that we experience such alienation and sort of existential dread, depression, has to do with the fact that we have so thoroughly come to believe ourselves separate from the natural world, such that when things that are naturally devastating or depressing or anxiety inducing affect us, we feel as though we're less than fully rational, less than fully human. And so I find Jennings' conception of whiteness in masculine terms, this is sort of some of the connections he begins making, really fascinating for this purpose, to think of, the white masculine European as the pinnacle of humanity, as the colonial imagination does, and to think of women and bodies of color as less than fully rational, less than fully human. I think because we have so deeply, in many ways, that's the air we breathe still, that I think part of what fuels our psychic dysfunction is this sense that we are operating as less than fully rational creatures when the world affects us. And so to me, it's important to therapeutically to relearn ourselves as ecological creatures, to see that the ideal of the white masculine European is illusory and is deeply destructive psychically and naturally and politically and in every way sort of imaginable. But one of the ways that I think gets left out is psychologically, and the damage that trying to imagine humanity in that way does to us. Whether we happen to achieve that sort of illusory ideal, as some seemingly do, or whether we are put in groups of others that fail to, or don't, or can't. So across the board, I think it becomes deeply psychologically damaging.
Thank you. it's interesting. That question made me think about in Judaism, thinking about trust. They say sleep is 1/60th of death. And you wake up, whenever you wake up in the morning, you're supposed to pray and thank God for still being alive, because you are like kind of putting this implicit trust in God, which is interesting. So there is a question in the chat for Sam. Would you say that the context of COVID-19 challenges or reinforces your thesis when remaining indoors is central to ensuring our collective security and health, a mentality that is no longer limited to the agoraphobic sufferer? How does the agoraphobic prerogative become woven into life being created and sustained?
Yes, so as I sort of think through this a little bit, anecdotally, COVID's like been a really great time to be agoraphobic, because like everybody's afraid to go outside. And like everybody is sort of inherently anxious when they enter into crowded places. So it's like all of a sudden the agoraphobe gets to be on even footing with everyone else. And like, I'm actually even more used to it than others. So that was a sort of funny observation that I made at the beginning of COVID. But there is, yeah, there's a sort of, just rereading your question. Yeah, I think COVID in many ways, and this is, I don't think this is an original observation, but enforces and illuminates and makes very clear this interconnected reality of our lives at the biological level. I mean, the virus reproduces inside human bodies and is shared between human bodies. There's a sense in which the interconnectedness, which means always vulnerability, can in fact be deeply death-dealing. I think a lot about Mayra Rivera's book, Poetics of the Flesh, and Rivera talks about this sort of fundamental fleshly interdependence as being and meaning always vulnerability. And the desire to withdraw from that vulnerability is what creates oppressive social structures, as Rivera sees it. The desire to remove ourselves, to deny this interconnectedness, gives us sort of the justification for othering people. And I think that COVID makes very clear that any ideas of ourselves as autonomous or detached or in any way not dependent on the material world of flesh and other bodies is deeply illusory. And I think maybe in some COVID denial, we see a strain of a desire to imagine oneself as actually separate, as, well, I'm not vulnerable to this. I think that's obviously a sort of cognitive dissonance in many ways. But yeah, there's sort of a lot of ways in which I think agoraphobia and the themes that I draw out, yeah, could go in any number of directions, seeing how COVID augments and sort of intensifies them.
Great, thank you. Does anyone have any other questions? I think we may have time for maybe one or two other ones. Jordan?
Hey, yeah, I really appreciated the presentation and would love to learn more. I'm curious about sort of with agoraphobia and this this desire to stay in one's house, and then ecology actually being like, right, the study of the home or the house. If you sort of drew any like overlaps between the sort of house as one's controllable home, and then ecology sort of like home being outside one's control and sort of including the natural world as well.
Yeah, so to respond to your first bit about being curious more, I'm putting my curious about more of what I'm thinking. I'll put my email address over here. I'm happy to share the paper with you if you want to send me an email. It's a little bit less of a whirlwind in its longer version. But yeah, the home, the question of home is interesting because in this sort of very brief presentation, it makes it sound like the home is a sort of constant source of comfort for the agoraphobe, but it's actually, the agoraphobe's relation to the home actually becomes very complicated because sometimes the walls of the home don't protect the agoraphobe from anxiety. And sometimes it actually becomes a zone of restriction where fear is heightened even. And of course, staying in the home has all sorts of negative effects on life. If agoraphobia sort of advances to the point where you can't leave the home, then home becomes both comfort and prison. And I think seeing the home as zone of control and safety, that's sort of the root of the attachment to the home in agoraphobic subjectivity. I think a big part of connecting that to ecology is learning one's place in the world, learning one's place in the natural world, learning one's place in the order of death and bodies and vulnerability and life, and these sort of cycles that I think our anthropological imaginary, our cultural imaginary mitigates against us accepting and recognizing, such that when the agoraphobe experiences those things as threatening, which they are, this is sort of simply part of what it is to be human. Like, it's a reality that these things threaten our existential security. What I see as the pathology of agoraphobia is not being able to constructively respond to that. And so, yeah, the relationship between ecology and just the oikos is one that I haven't teased out tremendously, but is certainly there. The theme of being at home in the world that I alluded to. Dylan Trigg, who I showed a slide of one of his books, that's his phrasing, being at home in the world and not being able to carry that sense out into the world. And so I think cultivating an ecological imagination, an ecological hermeneutic of oneself promises to play a really helpful therapeutic kind of role in agoraphobia.